Well, today we are going through Deuteronomy, and this will put us at the end of the Torah, or the Pentateuch. We're finishing the section, the first 5 books of Moses. We're also finishing the life of Moses. The very last thing that we'll see is the death of Moses in Deuteronomy. And that also brings us to the end of the third major historical sequence, or historical period. In Genesis, we saw the primeval period in the first 11 chapters, and then the remainder of the book, we saw the history of the patriarchs, the patriarchal period with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then Joseph. And then Exodus, we began with the Exodus period begins with the birth of Moses at the beginning of the book of Exodus, and continues until they arrive at the promised land and receive Moses' final instructions before crossing over, which is the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy. And so the book of Exodus through Deuteronomy, those 4 books are all the Exodus period. And then on Monday, when we start with Joshua, we'll be looking at the period of the conquest. And so this is the end of a lot of things today. The end of the Pentateuch, the end of the story of Moses, and the end of the Exodus period. So Deuteronomy, just to give you context and get you in the right mindset, let's talk briefly about the things that have happened in Moses' story up till now. Moses was born in Egypt. He and all of his people, all the Hebrews, are slaves in Egypt. But Moses is found after the order to kill all of the Hebrew boys. Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter and is rescued from that fate. And then he escapes from Egypt and is sent back. God sends him back to rescue the people, to lead them out of slavery. And through Moses, God does a long series of miracles and the 10 plagues on Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. And then even once they're released, Pharaoh still isn't quite ready to let them go. And when they look like they're lost against the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on your translation, the Pharaoh sends out an army to capture them. And God rescues them through the Red Sea. They walk through the sea on dry ground, and the army chases them, and God wipes out the army behind them. And so God leads them out totally miraculously without them lifting a finger, except for they're walking, and they're set free. They come out of the land of Egypt as free people. And then God leads them. Chat put up a map, so this is real handy for me. God leads them out of Egypt, and you can see this little kind of triangular piece of land here. This is the Sinai Peninsula. And God leads them out of Egypt and down to the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula to Mount Sinai. And there God comes to them and shows his power and his glory and gives them the commandments, gives them the 10 commandments, and tells them what relationship with him is going to look like, what the covenant is going to look like, kinds of things that they have to do to be his people. And when God gives them all those commands, shows them the commandments, tells them what they're going to have to do, the people all say, yes, we will do it. We will enter into this covenant. And then Moses goes up the mountain to receive the kind of hard copies. We say that as printed on paper. This means carved in stone. The hard copies of this covenant and the commandments. And when he comes back down, he finds that the people have already broken the covenant. They're down in the valley underneath the mountain, and they are worshiping a golden calf idol that Aaron made in front of them. And so they have already broken the covenant. And so Moses smashes the copies of the stone tablets that God had given him, and there's immediate consequences for the people. Many of them die, but God tells Moses to come back up the mountain with a second set of tablets, and God gives the Israelites a second chance to live in the covenant. And Moses comes back down, and they build the tabernacle, and at the end of the book of Exodus, they can't go into the tabernacle where God's presence is dwelling. They can't go in to worship. But then the book of Leviticus gives them all the instructions that they need to be able to worship God well, and once the system of sacrifices starts happening, and there's priests ordained to sacrifice, then the people are able to enter into the tabernacle, enter into the presence of God, and worship him there. The book of Numbers, we see the people celebrate their first Passover outside of the land. The last of the 10 plagues God gave on Egypt. The ways that the Israelites were to be protected from it was to paint blood on the doorposts of their home, and death would pass over them. They would not be visited by death in their homes as the rest of Israel would. And so and God gave it to them as a perpetual observance. They were to do it every year. And so here at the beginning of the book of Numbers, they have their first Passover outside of Egypt. And so they celebrate Passover, and then they begin to travel. And they start from the Sinai Peninsula, the kind of southern tip where Mount Sinai is, and they start heading northeast to come up to the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised to their ancestors. And so this land, most of this kind of leftmost part of this green area, this is all part of what God had promised to the people of Israel. And they come up and they send spies ahead, and just as they're getting kind of close, the spies come back, and 10 of the 12 spies report that even though the land is fantastic, the people there are too strong, we'll never be able to take it. And there are 2 others that say, yes, we can. You know, God is faithful. God has done all these miraculous things. God will give us the land if he promised it. But the people of Israel as a whole are so afraid that they refuse to go in. And as a result of that refusal, a result of their unwillingness to trust God and their disobedience, God tells them that generation, all of those that have seen all these miracles that God has performed, they're going to wander in the desert until they all die off. And God will take their children into the land to give the land to them, to give them the chance to come in. And so they wander in the desert, they wander in the wilderness all over the place for 40 years. And towards the end of that period of 40 years, they come to the eastern part of the Jordan River, which is this little area, this blue streak right here. They come to the eastern side, eastern bank of the Jordan River, not quite to the eastern bank of the Jordan River, but on the east side of the Jordan River to a mountain called Mount Nebo. And God tells Moses there to go up on the mountain and to basically give his final farewells and to remind the people of everything that they've been taught before, and to give his final farewells because he's going to die there and not lead his people into the promised land. And if you've forgotten, the reason for that is because Moses at one point was commanded to speak to a rock to bring water from it for the people, and instead, in his anger and frustration with the people of Israel, he claimed credit for bringing water from the rock and struck it instead. He disobeyed God. And so he is now with the rest of that older generation, and he is going to die before he enters the promised land as well. And so here they are. I mean, that's the stuff that has happened through most of Numbers and brings us to the beginning of Deuteronomy. And so the situation that we have is they have spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and that whole generation that had seen all those things, that was of adult age when all of those things happened, they've died off. And so now we have a new generation, a generation that was at best children at Mount Sinai, and most of them not born yet at Mount Sinai. And so they don't remember. They didn't see all of these things. And so Moses is going to reiterate. He's going to kind of rehearse or rehash a lot of the things that God has done over the last 3 books with this new generation. And so this book is named Deuteronomy, which comes from 2 Greek words meaning second law, Deuteronomos. And so the book name means second law. And it's basically, most of the material in Deuteronomy is going to be Moses summarizing what has happened before and then calling on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were, to do what their parents failed to do. And so again, second law, Deuteronomy, it's called second law because it is a repeat or a rehash of much of what has already been given before, both in terms of history and in terms of commands. Now, there is some new material, and there's a whole lot of encouragement or pleading or calling on this new generation to be faithful. So it's not all repeated material, but there is a whole lot of rehearsing or repeating stuff. So in Deuteronomy chapter 1, we get first a kind of a recap of things that have happened since Mount Sinai. And you'll find in Deuteronomy that Mount Sinai is often referred to as Mount Horeb instead of Mount Sinai. Different name, same place. The events being described are exactly the same as what you saw in Exodus when it was called Mount Sinai. So it's the same place. And one of the things that is pointed out or is mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 1 that I didn't go over in Numbers, but it's kind of important to know for the future, I just forgot it, honestly, is the appointment of various leaders over the nation, or over the people of Israel. There's over 1 million people in the camp, over 1 million people in Israel. And way back in Exodus, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, comes to him and says, look, there are too many people for you to be dealing with all their problems. Every time there's a conflict between people, they come to you to solve it. there's over 1 million people here. You don't have time in your day for that. And so appoint wise men to lead over various smaller portions, and they can bring you the things that are too complicated for them to deal with and handle all of the small fry stuff so that your day isn't just totally filled with dealing with everybody's bickering and complaints. And so Moses does. And then in Numbers, God tells Moses to appoint a body of 70 trusted elders to rule over the people. And so they kind of form the highest court of the land, or the last court before coming to Moses himself. Moses deals with everything that this group of 70 can't handle. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses reminds this generation of this appointing of these elders and the appointing of these leaders over all these different levels of the people. And then there's this group of 70 elders, or 70 leaders that form a body that persists all the way down to the New Testament era. It's called the Sanhedrin. The word Septuagint, if you remember when we were talking about the Greek translation of the New Testament, it was translated by a group of 70 scholars, and the word Septuagint had a relationship to the word 70 because of Latin, I think it comes through. Well, Sanhedrin, the word also has a relationship with the word 70, it's just in a different language. And so Sanhedrin, the term Sanhedrin refers to this body of 70 elders that form the kind of highest court in Israel. And you won't see the Sanhedrin referred to very often in the Old Testament, except for it being established here, and then there being a few times along the way where the elders of Israel are called to deal with something. But for the most part, you don't see the Sanhedrin in the Old Testament very often, but when you get to the New Testament, the Sanhedrin is there a lot. And you'll see lots of characters referred to as being members of the Sanhedrin, or you'll see things that the Sanhedrin does. And so, for example, Nicodemus in John chapter 3, John 3:16, that comes about as a result of this conversation with Nicodemus. Nicodemus is a Pharisee and a member of the Sanhedrin. And then when Jesus is arrested, he's not arrested by the Romans at first. He is arrested by the temple guard, and they take him to the temple to be tried by the Jewish court, the Sanhedrin. And so Jesus is tried before the Sanhedrin before he's tried by any of the Romans, before he's taken to Pilate. And so it's the Sanhedrin that condemns him and condemns him to death before taking him to Pilate and convincing Pilate to crucify him. And so the Sanhedrin it's this ruling body. It's a term that you won't run into much in the Old Testament, but it very much connects to the New Testament. And so this is where it comes from the councils that Moses sets up to deal with various problems in Israel, and the court system that Moses sets up at God's direction in Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But Moses rehearses much of the history of Israel, the same stuff that I've told you, this already in this lecture is kind of building up to what Deuteronomy is. And so he spends the first 3 chapters rehearsing this history so that all of these people know, so that they all, this new generation, hears what God has done for this nation and for their fathers and for their ancestors, so that they all know what God has done. And then in chapter 4, he begins to call them or to commend to them obedience, that they should do what God says. God has done all of these things. God has brought all these things about for our good. He's done all these amazing things, and he has promised to bless and to give this bountiful land to us and to our descendants if we are faithful, if we keep the covenant, if we do as he says, if we follow, if we are obedient to his commands. And so be obedient, do these things, because then we will receive the blessings. But if you don't, if you fail, if you're unfaithful, if you break your promise, if you don't keep the covenant, then curses, pain will come on us instead. There will be consequences. And he specifically refers to, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, 3 and 4, Moses refers specifically to an event where the people of Israel went and worshipped Baal. And this happens, if you remember last time, we had the prophet Balaam that had the talking donkey and tried to go and was called on and hired to go curse Israel, but he found himself unable to do anything but bless Israel instead. Well, after the whole sequence with Balaam ends, the people of Israel are there and they're in Moabite territory, and the Moabites are afraid to attack them, but they're still there and they're still among the people. They're still in the land, And what ends up happening is some of the men from Israel, or the Hebrew men, start noticing that some of these Moabite women are awful good looking. And they go and start sleeping with some of the Moabite women. Well, these Moabite women are worshiping Baal, and so they start inviting these men that are coming over from the Israelite camp and starting these relationships with them. They call them and then start inviting them to the sacrifices for Baal. And Baal was a Canaanite god that was worshipped in lots of different places among lots of different tribes in this area of Canaan. In fact, there's about as many different versions of Baal as there were cities in Canaan. So they all worship a version of Baal, and Baal was the Canaanite god of the sky and storms. And it was thought that there was almost always a goddess associated with Baal. There was Baal's consort, and this goddess would be the goddess of fertility or the goddess of the earth, and it was the union between Baal and this goddess that brought fertility and life to the land, because you can see rain fall, and that's what gives life to the crops, right? And so there's kind of this connection, and there was almost always this female deity connected with Baal, and their union is what brought fertility and plenty to the land. Is what made the crops grow and the animals reproduce and that kind of thing. And so the worship of Baal was almost always united with the worship of this other female goddess. The name was different from place to place. There were several different versions, but almost all of them involve some form of ritual or religious sex as part of it. It was the union between Baal and this goddess. And so when these men came over and started sleeping with these women, and these women started inviting them to these sacrifices and these worship of Baal, the men of Israel went and they started making sacrifices and worshiping Baal themselves. And so many of the men of Israel started committing idolatry as a result of their relationship with these Moabite women. And idolatry, I wrote it up here just in case the term is not familiar to you. It probably is by this point, but idolatry is the worship of an idol. It means to worship something that is not God, and either to sacrifice to it or to worship it, venerate it, honor it as being equal with God or above God. It's to worship something that is not God. Specifically, an idol, usually, is what we'll see in the Old Testament. So they went and they started worshiping Baal, this idol, this Canaanite god. And as a result, God brought a plague on the camp and then gave the command that everyone that had gone over and slept with these Moabite women and had gone and made sacrifices to Baal was to be killed. Every Israelite who had done that was to be killed off. And what's really interesting in the story, or was kind of heartbreaking and peculiar in the story, is that while they're there gathered around the tent, and Israel is weeping and mourning, the people of Israel are weeping and mourning and wailing at what has happened to them, at this idolatry and their failure, there comes a guy, an Israelite guy, leading one of these women through the camp to get to his tent so he can sleep with her. And one of the priests looks up and sees, his name is Eleazar, and this priest looks up and sees this man leading this woman through the camp to take him to his tent while they're all weeping and wailing the consequences of bringing these women in and sleeping with them. And so he takes up a spear and follows them back to his tent, and when he gets there, they're in the middle of it, and he takes the spear and drives it through the man into the woman, and they both die. And God looks at that situation, and he actually stops the plague on Israel because of that man's zeal, because of that priest's zeal. And that priest becomes the next high priest after Aaron dies. And so Aaron ends up dying by the end of the book of Numbers, and then we'll see Moses dies at the end of Deuteronomy. But Moses points to this situation with the Baal at Peor, which is the region that they were in when they committed this idolatry. It says, look what God did as a result of the Baal at Peor. If you obey God, you receive these blessings, but if you don't, there are consequences. If you don't trust him, if you don't follow him, you don't keep his commandments, and you chase after other gods, there's going to be consequences. And so he says, and then he gives this reason. Why are you supposed to obey these commands? Why is God giving you this set of commands? And the reason for it, God says, is because eventually, if you follow these commands, if you follow all the rules that I give you, you're going to be weird. You will stick out. You're not going to be like all the nations around you. And when you are weird this way, and the other nations look at you and they see you being weird and following these laws and commands that they don't have, and they see that your nation is prosperous and that these commands lead, they're wise commands and good commands that lead your people to thrive, they're going to look and see how good and wise the people are, and how good and wise the God who gave you these commands must be, and they'll be turned towards me. They'll be drawn toward me. And that was to be at least a step in the process through which God would fulfill the promise to Abraham that all nations would be blessed through his family. Because his descendants, his family, would be this weird people that would draw everyone's attention and everyone's desires toward God, toward the wisdom that God gave his people. And, of course, the people of Israel don't actually end up doing that very well. There's not really a protracted period over one generation, and not even one generation anywhere that I can think of, where the people are actually faithful to God for a protracted period. There's nowhere that they actually do that well enough for the people around them, the nations around them, to see how good God's commands really are. But that was God's intention. That's what God tells Moses to tell the people as the reason. And that's in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 7. It says, "Observe them carefully, the laws that God has given. Observe these laws carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations who will hear about these decrees and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them the way the Lord our God is near to us whenever we pray to him? And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as the body of laws I am setting before you today?" So this will show people how good God is if we obey it. It will show how good God is, and people will draw to him. And so this is the beginning. The Deuteronomy chapter 4 and all the way through Deuteronomy chapter 11 are this kind of extended call for the people to be faithful, to listen to and obey the commandments, to do better than their parents had done, so that they can receive blessings and not receive the consequences of their actions, and not have to deal with the consequences of failure. And God promises repeatedly through that if they don't obey, then the future is bleak for them. They won't get to stay in this land that God had promised their ancestors for very long. They'll be taken away. And then by the end of the book, Moses has repeatedly told them that this is going to be an issue. You will get, if you fail to obey these commandments, you'll be taken into captivity. Many of your people will be lost, and you'll be taken into captivity. But then even there, if while you're in captivity, your heart turns back to God and you will genuinely seek him, you will find him, and he will come and redeem you and rescue you and bring you home. As long as you seek him and are faithful. And so even after you have suffered the consequences, even after everything has gone terribly wrong, if you have failed and God has allowed these consequences to come on you, even then, if you will turn and seek him, all will go well for you, and God will bring you home. Then so that gets you through Deuteronomy chapter 4 and brings us up to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And Deuteronomy chapter 6 is extremely important, and it contains what is probably for Jewish people, at least, within Judaism, the most important passage in the Old Testament, or at least the one that is most frequently read and the one that's most frequently recited. And it's actually one that once I start reading it, you'll probably recognize as being something that Jesus quotes and uses in the New Testament. So this is in Deuteronomy chapter 6. It starts in verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." And then goes on from there for the next several verses to tell them how they're supposed to remember and to keep these. But I'll stop here for just a second. This passage, or this chunk that I just read, is called the Shema Israel, the Shema for short. The word Shema in Hebrew means listen or hear, and it's how the passage starts. Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. And so it's referred to just by the first phrase in it, but it's a passage that is incredibly important and is just kind of the very basic building block from which everything else in Judaism is supposed to come. It's kind of the core. To love the Lord your God with all your soul, heart, soul, and strength. And before that, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. That he is alone. There's only one like him, and you can have no other gods besides him. The Lord is one. Love him with all of your heart, soul, and strength. And so this is incredibly important, and if you read the instructions to go on from here, it's these commandments that I give to you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads and write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And if you go to Israel, if you went today, I went in 2012, so 10 years ago. Man, it's been a while. I got to go in 2012, and if you go and you go into somebody's home, or you go into most public buildings, or if you go into a hotel, every hotel room door, there will be this, in the corner of the door frame, there will be this little box. And inside that box, or tube, will be a rolled up scroll with a passage of Old Testament scripture on it, and it's usually this one. It's usually the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God. Because that last line in this section that says, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And then there's also that thing about write them on your foreheads and on your hands. If you go to most of the holy places, the most holy sites in Israel, including the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall, the last portion of the temple compound that still exists, which is actually just the retaining wall for the Temple Mount. But if you go to that site and you go anywhere that Jewish men are praying, most of them you'll see where they'll take out these little boxes with straps on them and they'll tie them around their heads. They're called phylacteries. They'll tie them around their heads or around their forearms or their hands, and they'll literally have this scripture written in a scroll on their foreheads or on their hands when they go to pray. And so they take this very literally, very seriously. When it says to teach your children, there was actually by the New Testament era, this passage was part of the ceremonial rite of passage to adulthood. So before you could be considered an adult, you had to go through this rite of passage, and part of it was quoting this verse, quoting this section. And so you literally could not be considered an adult unless you had this memorized and could recite it. It's that important in Judaism. And so it's the Shema, and it's very important. You do need to know it for anything. At very least, you need to know how it's referred to, what the word Shema is and where you would find it, and what the basic contents is. I'm probably not going to ask you to recite it or to write it all out verbatim on a test, but you're definitely going to need to recognize it on an exam. And so there's this very important passage, and then the stuff that flows from it, the commands that follow that, are all about making sure that it gets passed down to the next generation, that you tell it to your children and to their children, and that for all generations to come, you make sure that they know and they understand what God has done for the people, and that they are to obey and to follow God first. That they are to love God with all that they are and have God before anything else. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all. And so it's incredibly important that they pass this down to future generations, because they have seen what happens when a generation fails. Their parents failed, and they all died in the wilderness. So Moses points out in chapter 8 that they've been led through the desert for 40 years, and God has not allowed their clothing to wear out or their shoes to wear out or them to go hungry or without food. God has provided everything they need along the way. And again, it just continues through chapter 11 with this constant set of encouragements to remain faithful to God and to make sure that the future generations all hear and all understand, so that they will remain faithful to God, so that all of their descendants can remain in the land and remain under God's blessing. And then, so that chapter 11 kind of ends the first chunk of Deuteronomy, sometimes called the first speech of Moses in Deuteronomy. And then starting with chapter 12 and going on for the next several chapters, there is a section of laws. And so they've gotten the history run down in the first 3 chapters, and so now they're going to get a reminder of the laws. And actually, there is a repeat of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy chapter 5 as well. But starting in chapter 12, there's going to be this extended section of laws. And a lot of this is going to be reminders or minor expansions, but there are a few new things in here. And if you read through this section or any of the other sections of law and commandments in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the latter part of the Torah, there's going to be some stuff that looks really weird and even seems kind of backwards, or what in the world were they doing? One thing you got to remember, though, anytime you're looking at these commandments, is God is giving them in a very ancient context, and it's really helpful to compare what the Israelites were being told to do, what God was giving the Israelites to do, compared to what all of the other nations around them at the time were doing. We don't realize the degree to which our legal system and our sensibilities about right and wrong have been shaped by the commands in Scripture. And so we find these things, these are kind of the starting point, and then we go through Christianity, and then we go through 2,000 years of changes and development since then, and our legal sensibilities are very much based on these things and have gone, a good bit beyond them in the directions that they were going at the time. But God sets them on that trajectory here. And so the trajectory towards justice for all, for example, is begun in the Old Testament. And we look back on it now and we see how amniotic that was at the time, how very fledgling it seems to us. But if you look at it in comparison to the rest of the nations around them, what they had was actually really, really good. It was really amazing that God began them on this trajectory then. So for example, there's a you know what the tithe is, right? It's a tenth. 10% of your income given, that's the tithe. And God commands that they give a tithe to the temple, give a tithe to God every year. There's an annual tithe. But that's not the only tithe. In fact, they're told every third year to set aside another tithe for the poor. And so every third year, everybody has to set aside a tenth of their income and give it to the poor. Which means that basically, God is getting a tenth. A tenth is going to the Levites to honor God with, to run the temple with, and to survive on. But then there's another 3% that's given for the poor in every community in Israel, for the poor of every tribe in Israel. And then there's also a whole other set of laws dealing with harvesting and gleaning. There was a law requiring that one of the laws that God gave is a requirement that the Israelites not harvest their fields all the way to the edges. And so they have to plant their fields, and then when they go to harvest time, they have to leave a border of their fields unharvested. And the reason for leaving that border of the fields unharvested is so that a traveler going by, somebody that was passing through Israel, a foreigner, or somebody that was traveling and it's dangerous and expensive to travel in the ancient world, somebody that is traveling can reach out and just grab stuff as they're going by and eat and not starve to death on their journey. And then there's also a requirement that as the harvesters are going through the fields, they are not allowed to pick up anything that they drop. If you're walking through the field and you're harvesting grain and you've cut up a bundle and you drop several stalks of grain on the ground, you have to leave it and keep going. And there's also a command, they're told not to be too careful about harvesting and not to go back and do a second picking, to leave it in the field. And the reason for that was so that the poor could go along behind the harvesters and pick what they left behind or what they dropped. It wasn't their land, but they were by law, by God's decree, allowed to go behind the harvesters on anybody's land and pick up whatever they left behind. And then the harvesters were specifically commanded not to be too careful to pick everything so that there would be something for the poor that were gleaning behind. And so there's all these commands, all these laws, all these regulations dealing with the poor and making sure that they were provided for in the nation and that their rights were not infringed on, that things couldn't just be taken from them, or that they weren't unprotected. And so there was all these laws that ensured this kind of justice for the poor and provision for the poor. And now we may look back at it and say some of these things didn't go far enough, but if you compare it to the laws that were everywhere else in the region, every other nation around them, it was so far beyond anything that anybody else was doing that it was like another world. So when you are going back, if you see a law in the Old Testament, a command that God gives that is disturbing to you, check and see what the nations around them were doing at the time. Do that research and see how different what God told the people to do, how different it was from what the people around them were doing, and how much more generous or just what God told them to do actually was. So another very interesting, very cool thing that God commands in this section in Deuteronomy 17, God predicts or kind of foretells or foresees that in the future they're going to want a king. Now, all the other nations around them have kings to rule over them. The people of Israel don't have a king to rule over them. They have Moses that leads them and speaks to them on God's behalf, but ultimately, God is their king. God leads them. And at this point, they don't even have a land to have a king over, but God is their ruler. And everything that the people does is from God's command. People inquire of God, what should we do? Should we go this way or that way? What should we say? What should our laws be? These things are all created by God. But God sees that in the future, they're going to want a king. And so God gives regulations for who their king should be, who they should pick, and who they should anoint to be their king, and what kinds of regulations even the king has to follow. Which is a very weird thing in the ancient world, because the king was usually seen as being the representative of God or being divine himself. And so whatever the king said was law. Here in Israel, the king is under the law. The king has to obey the law. Is supposed to obey whatever the commands are given. And among those commands, the things that God says is, first, don't just pick anybody you want. It has to be an Israelite, and it has to be the one chosen by God. God will choose your king and anoint your kings over you. And we see that happening in the first several kings of Israel. And so it has to be an Israelite, and it will be the person that God has chosen to put over you. And then when this king is in control, the first thing that the king has to do is go and by his own hand, he has to go and make a copy of all of these laws and make a copy of all the commandments. And then he's to take that copy of the commandments, and it's to stay on his body the entire time that he's king. And he is to study that law, that scroll, every day to make sure that he knows what it says and that he is embodying it and enforcing those laws among the people. And so his role is to know and to enforce the laws that God has given, the commandments that God has given. Not to create his own, not to go off in his own direction, not to go off on his own tangent. And then God also specifically tells them that the king is not to acquire great wealth for himself, or to amass great piles of gold and silver, or to acquire great numbers of horses and chariots, or to marry a whole bunch of women and have many wives. And because if he does those things, then his heart will be led astray. And as we'll see when you get into the later history of Israel, the kings do all those things. Even Solomon, the very first, the one seen as the wisest king, by the end of his life, has 1,000 women in his harem, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and he's got this absolutely enormous stables of horses with tens of thousands of animals in the stables. And he's got gold and silver on everything. You can't even find a surface in the palace or in the government buildings that isn't covered with gold and silver. He breaks every one of these commands, and by the end of Solomon's reign, he has enslaved his people. And they're basically no better off in Israel than they were in Egypt. So, God tells them all these things. This is what the kings are going to want to do. They must not do it. And that they should be the embodiment of the law. They should be the embodiment of my commands. And they should learn these commands and enforce them every day, study them every day. And so even though they don't end up doing it, God gives these commands to regulate how the king should behave, how they should act. And so this section ends, the section of laws, the laws of Deuteronomy ends, and we get a final speech by Moses that is, again, him encouraging and pleading with the people to remain faithful to God so that they'll receive all of the benefits and the blessings of following and obeying him. And so the culmination of this plea, or this pleading with them and this calling on them to obey God, comes in Deuteronomy chapter 30. And it comes down finally to he says, here before you there are two ways you can go. You can obey God and receive all of these blessings and all these benefits. The land that God will give you is a good land, and you can live in it for generation after generation. God will keep your people and your descendants there as long as they obey him and are faithful to the covenant. That's one choice. All the blessings and all the benefits, life. Or you can disobey him, and you can chase after other gods, and you can do these other things. And if you do that, you won't receive the blessings that I have promised you. You'll receive the curses and the consequences. And your people will not live in this land. They'll be taken out, and others will rule over them and take them away, and they'll have to live among foreigners that are worshiping other gods. And it's all of these terrible things will happen if they disobey. And so here I'm setting before you these two choices, these two realities. It's life or death, blessings or curses, obedience or disobedience, faithfulness or unfaithfulness. And so the final plea is choose life. It's look in chapter 30, starting verse 15. It says, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commandments, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you're entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you're not obedient, if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God and listen to his voice and hold fast to him. For the Lord is your life, and he will give you many years in the land he swore to give to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And of course, the people, having this very clear-cut choice put before them, they say what sensible people would. We choose life. We'll follow him. We'll do what we'll obey these commandments. We'll remain faithful to the covenant. We choose life, and we choose the blessings. We will follow him. And Moses, in a moment of kind of prescience, I guess, after 40 years of leading the people, he knows them well enough to know that they won't. And so he tells them, in future generations, you will not. You will break the covenant. You will fail to follow God. You're too stubborn and stiff-necked as people. You won't be able to do it a little long term. And so he reminds them one last time, you will fail, and this will all happen. You will be carried out of the land. God will take the land away from you and give it to others. You will be carried out of the land, and you'll be forced to live among foreigners. He says, but even there, if you seek him, call out for him, you will find him, and he will bring you home. And so Moses finishes his final speech, and he calls Joshua up, and he passes over leadership of the nation to the young man Joshua. And then he goes up to the top of Mount Nebo, and God shows him, he can see across the Jordan River and into the promised land, and he looks across, and he's able to view the land that God has promised to his ancestors after leading his people for 40 years. And as God shows him the land, and there on the top of Mount Nebo, he dies. And God buries him. An angel comes and takes his body and buries him. And nobody knows where the tomb is. And that's kind of the end of the story. And Joshua takes control, takes leadership of the people, and prepares to lead them into the promised land. And the book of Deuteronomy, the end of his life, of Moses' life, in Deuteronomy 34, the last few verses, says Moses was 100 and, well, go ahead and read the bit of the burial too. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him. God buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died. Yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, because Moses had laid hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him, and did what the Lord commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and all his officials and to the whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all of Israel. And that's it. That's the end of Moses' life. So on Monday, we'll pick up and we'll start with Joshua's role as leader and the people crossing over into Canaan and the beginning of the period of the conquest where they conquer the promised land. And I'll warn you, there's some stuff in Joshua that's probably going to be disturbing. And we'll see God give commands to wipe out entire cities. Just on a couple of occasions, God will say to kill every man, woman, and child in the city. And that passage or those commands are often very disturbing to people. But there is one final bit in Deuteronomy that I want to leave you with. There's a particular moment where God tells the people, as he's giving them the commands and everything that they're to do in the future, Moses warns them, when God takes you into the land and brings you into the land to conquer it and to possess it, don't say this is because we are righteous. Because of our righteousness, God has rewarded us with this land. He says, it is not because of your righteousness, but because of their wickedness, and because of God's faithfulness to his promise to your fathers. And so we aren't always told exactly what the issues of the people in the land were, but there had been some really terrible things happening in Canaan, including in several places infant sacrifice, where babies were killed as part of offerings and sacrifices to their gods. And so God has seen the evil there, and we're seeing God using Israel to judge the evil in Canaan without knowing exactly what all the evil in Canaan was. But God isn't just sending the people of Israel in to wipe out these innocent people so that they can have land because God likes them and doesn't like the Canaanites. God is using the Israelites to judge evil that had been going on in Canaan, and in the process fulfilling his promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so on. So when we get there, there'll be moments that are kind of disturbing, but keep that in mind as one of the things that's happening in Joshua. God is using Israel as an instrument of judgment. As we will see later, God using other nations as instruments of judgment on Israel. That's it. See you on Monday.